This is a Goodman's Module 80. It was made around about 1973-74 and it's in so-so condition. There are a couple of quite nasty scratches on it, but I think that's retrievable. The first thing I've got to tell you about it is someone has had a go at the cabinet and I suspect fairly recently because I can smell it. But someone's got some stain and just slopped it all over it. And the consequences are it's slightly sticky and looks horrible. Now the other really horrible thing that someone has done to this is put this switch on there. I suspect it's because the switch here has failed, because this is how you turn it on. That switches it on and is connected to speakers 1, and that's the power. So I suspect the wafer on the back is faulty. But again, I think that's something we can deal with. I'm not quite sure how we can deal with this switch, but I didn't think this was going to be easy. I bought this on Trade Me here in New Zealand, mainly for a bit of nostalgia, because I've not seen one of these since the 70s, when I used to sell them in my shop. When I told a colleague I was going to buy one of these to refurbish, he said, "You must be crazy," because they weren't that good when they were new. Well, let's clarify that. When I say not that good, they were made by Thorn, which is a television company in the UK, or was, and unfortunately the way they built this inside is very similar to the way they build domestic TVs, i.e. all low-grade components. It did sound very good, and it used to retail for about £90. Now today that sounds a foolishly low number, and I actually paid more than that to buy it second hand. It produces about 30 watts. Now, in its day, British electronics, and possibly even still today, I don't know, was classed as some of the best around. In fact, when I had my shop, it was quite hard to sell what was in those days Japanese electronics. For the price range, this would not be classed as entry, but it would be classed as lower mid hi-fi. And the equivalent Japanese Panasonic or Techniques or something like that for the same price would have offered half the power, and they didn't sound as good. And that's for sure. I mean, the British amplifiers, Cambridge Audio, Quad, Armstrong to a lesser degree, but they all had a better overall power output and fidelity. It's an FM tuner, and it's designed to run off a pickup, and of course in those days nothing else was invented. It's got tape monitoring. We're going to take the lid off and have a look at the disaster inside. You're going to see this live with me because I've just received it in the post, and I've just got my camera out, and here we are. Now this is the back, and you will be amazed at this heatsink. Each one of those runs one amplifier, and the size of the heatsink makes some of today's amplifiers put to shame, because this is for a 30-watt amplifier. Look at it. And it's outside of the cabinet, not stuck inside. Quite frowned on today, possibly, and I don't really know why, are the fact that the inputs are DIN. Now, I was brought up on DIN, and most of the British and European electronics of its day was DIN, and it was kind of the HDMI of its day, insofar as one plug can have stereo input and stereo record for your tape recorder of its day. If you did the same thing today, you'd have to have a lead with 4 phono plugs on it. So this was really a good way of doing things, and I must admit I quite like DIN plugs. simply because one plug, plop it in, and it's working. The aerial is a 300 ohm balanced socket, but to be quite honest, you can just put a 75 ohm coaxial lead into here, and from my memory it always worked very well. The tuner on this is actually pretty good. Now the other side's got mains adjustment and an AC socket of its day. Probably, I think they're actually illegal these days, but we won't worry about trivial things like that. And the speaker connections, it's able to run 2 pairs of speakers simultaneously or separately, and they are DIN speaker plugs. Well, my first look inside, fairly generous conventional mains transformer, typical layout of its day, a bit of a bird's nest, but I can see here there's a capacitor. It's a little bit bulgy. This is not a split rail, this is a single rail and capacitively coupled. So that capacitor is definitely not looking very good. I'm told it works, sort of, was the quote. Someone's tried it with an auxiliary input and said it seems to work okay, but bearing in mind the guy's trying to sell it to me. But he did say the FM tuner works, but it's quite faint. It's been a week since I last spoke to you, and a few things have come to light. Now, amazingly, the amplifier side of this works, and works very well. I suspect it's been recapped. When, I don't know, because I've had a look at all the capacitors and they're certainly not the originals. Now I think I've probably bitten off a bit more than I can chew with this. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but the faults that I've found so far is, you can see here the tuning indicators, and these work in such a way that with no signal they are both lit up, and when you tune in, one of them goes out and the other one comes on full brightness, and then when you actually get it on tune, they both light up brightly equally. So in other words, they tune for the center position, which is perfect. And I must admit, from memory in the past, that's something that always worked very well. Now the little lamps on this are 6-volt, tiny little things, which I may have trouble getting. I haven't looked yet, but these 2 bulbs in here actually still work, but they don't light up. This is in fact the board responsible for the tuning indicators. There are 2 germanium transistors here, which are the transistors that are actually the switching transistors for each of those lamps. And I thought, oh, germanium, they're cooked, faulty. And I've taken them both out and tested them, and they work fine. That's a little disappointing because the lamps are okay, and the drive transistors, they basically have a lamp in the collector. There are also 3 silicon transistors, which I haven't taken them out of the circuit yet, but they certainly aren't short or anything nasty like that. I put the meter on them. All the resistors on here have gone high, so I've replaced this one, these 2, and this one here was an odd value that I've had to make up with 2 resistors. But I haven't tried this since I've done those things. Most of the capacitors on here are these, I don't know whether you call them this, but I always know there was licorice all sorts capacitors. I don't know how they fare, but clearly none of these capacitors, or even this type, I don't even know what this type is, to be honest, other than to say they're not paper in the conventional sense, and obviously there's some here ceramic, which I wouldn't have expected those to change or go faulty. So I'm going to put this back into the machine and see if that cures the problem, but I suspect not. The other thing that doesn't work is the stereo light. Now, as it happens, the bulb was faulty, but there's no volts actually across the bulb anyway, so it wouldn't have lit even if the bulb was okay. So there's obviously another fault in the multiplex decoder. This board here is the multiplex decoder, and I've had a quick look at it, and on a visual inspection, which is obviously not the way to do it, I can't see anything wrong with it. Now, again, I suspect all the capacitors, like this one, has been changed. They certainly weren't original like that. They were orangey things from memory. So at some point in its life, somebody has recapped all this, and certainly in the amplifier section here, the actual amplifiers work pretty well, and these aren't original capacitors either. So someone's had a go at it, but I suspect it could have been 20 odd years ago. So am I looking at another recap job? I don't know. Now this board here is the IF strip basically. Just here, just behind this screen, if I pull this around a bit, there's actually an RF preamp, and there is a small coil on there. It's just a single transistor, and I've just tweaked the capacitor, in fact, and brought the sound up somewhat better. It's just must have drifted. But that board does work. It gives about 6 dB of gain, because if I connect the signal to the output, that's my estimation of the 6 dB. Now, here lies the problem. My knowledge ceases at about 25 kilohertz, and largely so does my equipment. My well, it's hardly an audio, my function generator goes up to 20 megahertz, and clearly that is not going to cut the cloth for FM. I can deal with the 10.7 megahertz IF strip if need be, but I've already checked that it is actually aligned at that frequency. I haven't tweaked anything, and also I don't have the knowledge of FM that I should have. Now, mainly because I've never had cause to deal with it. I've always been interested in audio and very little in receivers, to be honest. Now, when I bought this thing, I thought that the likelihood of the tuner not working would be quite slim, and I thought the problems would be capacitors and the amplifiers themselves possibly blown up. That side of it all works, and so what's left is woodwork, sorting the cabinet out, sorting out the FM tuner. And the guy was right. He says it does sort of work, but it's not as sensitive as it used to be. Clearly doesn't pick up stereo, and you need the volume gain on full. But it's got nothing to do with the preamp circuit, because auxiliary inputs have stacks of gain. Here lies the problem. Will I ever be able to get this running? I don't know whether the fault on the FM tuner is because someone has been at the coils and tweaked them, in which case I can't really deal with it other than if it's the IF. Or is there an actual wiring error? Have they put something incorrectly in there? And the type of resistors they used in here are renowned for going high, and after so many years I suspect I could end up replacing virtually all the resistors, because it's not like valve circuits where if you've got a 1 meg resistor, if it goes 1.5 meg, it really doesn't make any difference. Transistors, on the other hand, luckily they're only a couple of germanium. The rest are all silicons, so I don't have a problem, but I don't think there's any faulty transistors as yet. I'll pop some circuit diagrams as the maximum that I've got. So if there's anyone out there that's ever worked on these that can offer some help, I will be grateful, immensely grateful, because I would like to get this going. I realise it's not something that's ever going to be worth any appreciable money, but it's a nice piece of kit for what it was. I know all these wires are disconnected. It doesn't normally look quite as messy as that, but I've got several boards out. Any advice anyone can give me that they know about these machines? It's a pity there's not someone in New Zealand lives nearby that can deal with the RF section for me, but I fear not.